Thank you very much, and thanks to the entire team of the Coolidge Corner Cinema for inviting me today. It's such a thrill to be talking about Hedy Lamarr. I've been talking about her in my class on communications now for going on almost 2 decades, which is a scary thing to think. But I really never thought that I would have the opportunity, as I do tonight with you, to introduce her work to a much broader audience, and in particular the significance of her work in the context of the technology that we all enjoy today, that all of you have, but I'm sure you've all turned off. This is a reminder if you haven't, and I should check that I have too, to see really how the insight that she had so early on in the development of our technology, and so much of what she proposed turned out to be, I would argue, the right approach, and in some areas I would argue also has yet to be realized fully to what extent it is the right approach. So I'm not a historian, I'm not a biographer, I'm an engineer. So I'll be presenting her work really from the perspective of the engineering, of what it means in terms of design, in terms of utility. And in particular, this gave me a chance to pore through her patent. Very often when we talk about technologists or scientists, we have the opportunity to peruse a large body of work to try to divine how their thought process evolved over different pages, different ages. But that's not the case for her. She was not publishing in what was the technological mainstream academic literature at the time. She was not participating in conferences. She was not part of the technological community in any sort of standard fashion. And so really what we have is this little gem, this fairly brief patent with only 6 claims. Now, how many of you have read patents in the audience? Yeah, so how often do you see a 6-claim patent? Not much, you know. It either indicates that you were really trying to save money on the claims, or that you just really, really, really knew what you were doing and you could just get away with 6 claims. And I don't know if the former was the case, but I can tell you that the latter certainly is. It really is a remarkable piece of pithy, completely well-designed work. So Hedy Lamarr was interested in armaments. Her first husband had been, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that, in the armaments business. And, you know, I'd like to take you back, if you will, to the 30s, which is at the time that there was the big buildup that was occurring ahead of World War II. Of course, the Spanish Civil War was already raging, and a lot of the Nazi armament was being deployed and, in fact, to a large extent tested in the context of the support for Franco's regime against the Republican side. So we are still at a point where many of the things that we take for granted are quite incipient. The type of radios that were available were really extremely close to what had been developed really at the turn of the century by Marconi and others. The types of ways in which the electromagnetic waves were being transmitted were very, very rudimentary. This is at a time when hiding information, we've all heard probably of the Enigma machine and the considerable role that the breaking of the Enigma machine, often associated with, and rightly so, with the name of Turing, was having in terms of really changing the approach of warfare to what we would recognize nowadays as more an information warfare. So in that context, you have somebody who's coming, you know, she's very young at the time, with a fresh outlook and with a particular problem in mind. And the problem that she was looking at was the problem of how do you control what is mostly torpedoes, but which she talks any dirigible craft. Okay, and if you think of dirigibles, of course, we think of the Zeppelin that had sort of at that point, after World War I, they were really no longer in use. But you can think of, for instance, unmanned air vehicles, which we talk about so often in the news now because they've become very well known in terms of current warfare, but also things like drones and so on, anything that was being remotely directed. So she's thinking about the problems in this, and she's particularly thinking about conversations that she's heard about how very difficult it is to be able to control. So you're looking here at remote control of unmanned vehicles, in effect in the 30s, at a time when these things were barely known to be possible. Up until then, really, when you were talking about torpedoes, you were talking about something that got launched and basically, followed whatever trajectory the ballistics would dictate. You weren't thinking of adjusting in the way that she was thinking of adjusting. So this was already, she was talking about what would be considered now, maybe mainstream, but certainly extremely modern warfare. She was already thinking about this in the 30s. But probably the effect that her work has had most deeply, and one of the reasons she is associated in our minds with radio communications, is that even though her purpose was the control of torpedoes, the particular approach which she proposed really came completely out of left field. Completely out of left field. And it's particularly an approach that's called spread spectrum. And if I could ask you to go to the next slide. This is a little picture of how it is that we access spectrum. So we all have access to the electromagnetic spectrum. We access it with our cellular phones, we access it with Wi-Fi, we access it with Bluetooth, and there's sort of a few different main ways in which to access this. And this is going to be relevant for this patent. I'd like to think of it as, in effect, we all get to share a piano. So how would you actually go ahead and share a piano with people? Well, one of the things you could do is the first panel there on the left. FDMA stands for frequency division, multiple access. And in effect, what's going to happen is you're going to give different octaves of the piano to different people. So I'm going to play on one octave, you're going to play on another octave. And this way, we can each go ahead and play our pieces and just not get into each other's way. The other approach there on the top right is time division multiple access. So in time division multiple access, what's going to happen is when I have the piano, I have it all to myself. And then we're going to take turns. And when I'm done playing, I'll give it back to you. And then we'll rotate in a round-robin fashion in how we access the piano. What Hedy proposed, along with her co-author, Antheil, who was a composer and a pianist, is actually something that looks roughly like that, if you'll forgive my clumsy attempt at iconography of frequency hopping, which is that, in effect, one of the things that she recognized is that we have a lot of spectrum. We have more spectrum that we can fill. And by the way, even though there's a lot of discussion currently about being spectrum starved relative to conversations in the FCC, with the FCC, if any of you follow that, that discussion in technology, we're not really spectrum starved in the sense that we're spectrum starved in those slices of spectrum that have been allocated for different uses. There is actually lots and lots of spectrum available. So she realized that spectrum was something that was plentiful. And what she proposed was a sort of hopping around, both in time and frequency. So using them simultaneously, consciously using them simultaneously. And the approach that she proposed actually has really three main benefits. The first benefit, which was the one that she had in mind, was that if you see something like this and the hopping is happening in a fairly swift fashion, then if you're trying to jam that, where would you put your energy? There's a lot of spectrum You can't possibly jam all of the spectrum. You would need way too much energy. You would need a very strange, very wide transmitter. And therefore, this hopping around is basically forcing your adversary, your jammer, who's trying to put energy to interfere with your transmission, is basically making him having to go all over the place, trying to find you. And you're basically playing a game of very fast hide and seek in spectrum. The second thing that is sort of hinted at in here, but it became really not understood until much, much later, is that if you have an electromagnetic channel, a spectrum, I'll talk about that later, in the spectrum, which is changing in time, because you have obstacles, because you are in an environment that has a lot of dynamic elements and time-varying aspect to it, then it's actually very, very difficult to capture the signal and hold on to it. But actually, this sort of hopping does happen to be extremely robust to it. And the third element that she had was also that it was easy in this way to add confusing signals to it. So basically, you're hopping around, people are trying to jam you, but also you're hiding your signal. You're hiding your signal also because you can add, and they have a beautiful description of how to do this. You can add some spurious signals in there. So maybe my signal is really only the pink ones. And you are the jammer, and you're trying to even figure out how on earth you're going to get me on those pink squares. But on top of that, I'm going to send the blue squares. And you're not going to be able to interpret without the knowledge at the sender and the receiver. And there is very much in here an embedded notion of cryptography, which is entirely in the subtext, but for somebody who's familiar with military communications is extremely clear, is really embedded in here beautifully. This actually does an amazing job with data hiding. I want to come to the one there on the right, this sort of mixture of all colors. That's often what has been associated actually with commercial spread spectrum. And many of you may be familiar with commercial spread spectrum because one of the companies that has quite successfully built on that is Qualcomm. That was definitely recently in the news, and Qualcomm really brought something that came again from military communications into the civilian world. Interestingly enough, this kind of direct sequence spread spectrum, if we go back to the idea of the piano, imagine that the way that we're sharing is we're actually going to all talk all over each other. So we're going to be sharing the whole piano at the same time, but I am going to be playing Chopin and you're going to be playing Gershwin, and somebody is going to say, I'm just tuning into the Gershwin, I can tune out the Chopin, and somebody is going to just be able to tune out the Gershwin, and basically that's exactly it. Those are codes. That's what we use, code. So the direct sequence, the sequence, is in effect what type of sequence, what kind of transmitter you're using. So this direct sequence spread spectrum, which was used, which again has this idea of using the fact that we have a lot of spectrum relative to the absolute needs that are required for transmission. That actually turned out to be quite fragile when you have the kind of time-varying channels that I just mentioned. And if we can go to the next slide. This is my clumsy engineering, absolutely not cool-looking attempt at describing a wireless channel. Next. So basically, here's a car, and he's traveling on that. Actually, my walls didn't show up, so let's go back to the previous slide. So I'm going to show you the car, and I have an abscissa, and I label I always label, because you have to label. You know what happens to you if you don't label, right? So going from left to right, you have time on the abscissa, and on the ordinate, you have the real parts of the impulse response. So remember from your electromagnetic days that we have a signal which has a real part and an imaginary part. Or another way to think about it is it has a phase, okay? And if it's turning, then in effect that corresponds to a phase shift. Okay, so that will be the turning. So everybody remembers Doppler, right? Like you hear, right? And that's a phase shift, basically, in the sound. Well, the same thing is happening when you're going in the electromagnetic domain. As things are getting closer, things are getting further apart, that means that actually your signal is rotating. And as it's rotating, sometimes the real part is big, and sometimes most of the energy is going towards the imaginary part, then going back to the real part, so the thing is just basically rotating. And that rotation, if we go to the next one, I tried to choose a car that looks like Hedy would read. I didn't have that much in the way of clip art, but that looks like a good Hedy car. And so you see the different signals here that are basically reflecting off the wall that you had on the left, on the right, and so on. Somehow my build didn't work. It was a build. You were supposed to see the previous part, but it didn't work as a build. And then if you go to the next part, basically the car has moved, and these different paths. That's basically exactly like having echoes in a room, right? So there's an echo going from the back of the room to me. It's muffled. We don't really hear it, but if the echo was happening in a way which was not muffled, and there was enough of a gap between my talking and my receiving the echo, you would hear it. It's exactly the same thing that happens in the electromagnetic spectrum with different echoes from the different obstacles, but the obstacles are all moving. So now what you have is you have some of these paths rotating in one direction as they're getting closer, in another direction as they're getting far, and now they're overlapping with each other, and sometimes they're constructively interfering, and sometimes they're destructively interfering. So they're up and down, going all over the place. Okay? That makes for a complete mess in the electromagnetic spectrum, and it deals to two main aspects, if we go to the next slide, which is this Doppler shift that I told you about, the rotation, and also the time spread, which is the time between when I first hear the signal and then all of the echoes that come afterwards, which actually confuse my transmission. And the frequency hopping that she suggested really has been shown recently, and actually a fair amount of my research is on anti-jamming basically reliable communications under jamming situations. It turns out that what she proposed, it's actually been shown, but really I would say over the last maybe 10, 15 years by myself and others, to be optimally reliable. That is the absolute best way in terms of throughput of countering these kinds of effects, and particularly also jamming. So it's very interesting. By the way, of course, as part of this, I was able to go online and sort of consider a little bit what was the context in terms of some other patents on secure communications. And, compared to this patent, they look, it's like reading a PhD thesis and the other one is like, a fourth grade project. I mean, fourth grade projects can be great, but, it really is. The other aspects they look so contrived. You have a little bit of, mixing around. So, you're switching a few things around. You're sort of modulating it with the voice. You're clipping here and there. I mean, you're really talking about, massive tinkering, really, really ad hoc. And she sort of comes in and just hits on the optimum thing, the actual optimum thing, way before it's going to be proved. It's really remarkable. So the other thing I wanted to give you a little bit of a background is, remember that this kind of frequency, and she talks very cleanly about oscillators, about having different frequencies. So remember how we were talking about the piano? Well, how would you know that I'm hitting different notes? Well, obviously you hear it. But how would you know that I'm hitting different notes if you didn't have ears? Well, maybe you have tuning forks. You would have a tuning fork and you would hit it, and if it resonates when you hit a note, you would know that was the note I hit, right? That's an oscillator. That's what a tuning fork is. And that's exactly what she's talking about using here, using a variety of oscillators, which is exactly the kind of frequency hopping that's been done in military systems now for a long time, but certainly was not being done in her time at all. I wanted to maybe also give you a little bit of feeling about what this meant in terms of communications at the time. So we're talking about 1941, by the way. I should have mentioned that at the beginning. Most people here probably have heard maybe of Edwin Armstrong, who is the father of the super heterodyne receiver, the heterodyne receiver, and of course, more famously, of FM radio. So at this time, the FCC has just assigned to him a little bit of spectrum. The radios are still not, there are a few radios, but they're still not commercially widely available. So this idea that you would have more than one carrier frequency, because of course he was looking at modulating on frequency versus modulating on amplitude like AM radio. The idea that you would have at this time this sort of transmission was in itself absolutely bleeding edge. He had himself, only just a few years before, put together all the patents around this. And imagine, of course, he's put together patents that have been bought by RCA for $1 million. Imagine $1 million in the 30s. And, and of course, he had a whole team. She didn't have a team. Again, she didn't have this sort of community. This was just a friend who was helping her out. And was really helping her out. I mentioned that the piano analogy is useful because, again, he was a pianist and he had been learning how to, in effect, do very simple programs with punch cards. This is before punch cards were really known the way they became known later for us in the 60s and 70s, with punch cards just for basically a pianola style of instruments. Even though, again, she's not a technologist, the patent, with formal training, the patent is extremely clear on implementation, gives a very, very clean implementation, and is clearly done by somebody with what I would say is really a state-of-the-art knowledge of electrical engineering at that time. Really, it's quite well done. So they were not taken seriously. Are people using it right now? Absolutely, in many ways. I mentioned your phones. The recent maybe if we can go back to the first slide, the recent developments in the phones actually used this sort of blocking of frequencies and time. It's what we call the orthogonal frequency division multiple access, OFDM. So you may have heard of OFDM. Probably not. You look like you have full lives. You probably don't hear about OFDM. Yeah, but anyway, if you're in the industry, you would have heard of OFDM. It's very much looking like that. And actually, I was looking a little bit at what was the recent developments in UAV, and I found a paper from 2015 where they did a bunch of tests, and they came up going, we really should be doing OFDM in UAVs, and ask Hedy. She could have told you this. So with that, I think I'll stop, and thank you very much. Enjoy the show.